Welcome, my dear friends. It's great to see you again. In case we haven't been introduced, I'm Stephen Clements, a writer, a gamer, and an appreciator of big brain activities in general. On this channel, I perform dramatic story readings, I provide role-playing game and movie reviews, and I get to talk to interesting people. In this episode, we are doing part 2 of my short story, Daniel and the Dragon, which originally appeared in the Beginning, a short story collection dedicated to dark young adult retellings of Bible stories. And since I got to open the collection with Daniel and the Dragon, that makes me proud because that means the first story a reader's going to come across is me giving honor unto the prophet Daniel and his sidekick Habakkuk. If you haven't checked out part 1, I do suggest you do that before you get to part 2 because it goes in order. Part 1, Part 2, I know it's an elaborate scheme. And if you want a copy of this for yourself, you can get a hold of it on Amazon.com. There's a lot of good stories in here, besides my own. Of course, it might be the best one. But without further ado, let's get back into Daniel and the Dragon for Part 2, which is the finale. The next morning before dawn, Hab escorted Daniel through the dust-covered streets, past a small army of slaves furiously sweeping so as to remove the sand from the mud-brick pavement, for the King of Kings parade through the city. A grand procession was soon to begin, to impress upon the mind of Babylonians the glory and power of Cyrus, their lord and master. Daniel was to await the arrival of the king at the procession's end, on a platform among the highest nobles of the land. The king's favorites were to stand far above the assembled throng on the platform of an enormous ziggurat erected for Sin, the moon god. Hab knew that he could not join his master with the court, as he was not Daniel's kin. He often wondered why Daniel had never adopted him, as the rabbis encouraged to be done with orphans. No, instead, Daniel had raised him with the same level of interest a teacher has for a student. He was deeply concerned that Hab learn the mystic and occult teachings Daniel placed before him, but not much beyond that. Hab was too nervous to ask why, for fear that Daniel might realize what a burden he had been and send him out to fend for himself, alone in a cruel world. He did not ask the rabbis or elders, because he knew they didn't like him. At the synagogue, he heard the other young men talk about work, making shoes or sewing leather, simple, important tasks done with their hands. Hab knew that none of them would understand his day's work, following his master into Stygian pits and burning out demon-worshipping necrophiles. He and Daniel lived lonely lives. His self-defeating thoughts were interrupted by his master's voice. "Regardless of what happens, trust the king. He will not betray us to Belshazzar's direst wish. We may be exiled for a time, but we will live. Our faith in Cyrus will prove well placed," Daniel said, answering questions Hab hadn't asked, in a tone better suited to convincing himself than others. Hab's ears perked up, catching the nervousness of his master. Living with someone who confidently spoke of God's will almost every day, this was odd. He wondered if God had been silent for this day's trial. Daniel spoke again. "You will keep everything we discussed between us." Daniel paused and turned to look Hab in the eyes. "Of course you will." Hab stopped walking abruptly, surprised by the sudden change in his master's demeanor. Daniel smiled, the wrinkles furrowing his face. "Of course, I can trust you. I have taught you secrets I trusted in no one else, and I have trusted you in my life. You have always proven true," Daniel finished, beaming with pride at Hab. Hab was at a loss for words. He knew that Daniel was pleased with his studies and knew that Hab was strong enough to survive any encounter they faced. But to say such a thing so directly confounded him. But this time that felt okay. Still smiling, Daniel turned and continued walking toward the ziggurat, now only a few paces away. The spectacle of Cyrus the Persian's processional through Babylon overwhelmed Hab. Dancers, musicians, priests, and retinues of soldiers from the 100 nations loyal to the King of Kings marched before him. The king himself was the greatest spectacle, seated on his ivory throne, wearing a robe of fine spun gold, shining like a second sun in the sky, riding on a great platform borne aloft by a company of sacred bulls, wreathed in garlands of flowers. Upon reaching the ziggurat, King Cyrus turned to the crowd and raised his hand for silence. His voice boomed through the city from on high. "People of Babylon, my people, my flesh, my blood! You have shown great honor and love to your king, and know that your king's heart is filled with love and kindness for you. Together, We have shown our obedience to all the gods, and so prepare yourselves for the bounteous feast we will share together." Hab wildly cheered and clapped, as did the horde of spectators. Raising his hand to silence his subjects once more, Cyrus continued, "It is my greatest concern for all of my peoples and nations that they receive justice from their king, as they receive the blessings from the gods. Come to me, my people. Tell me your woes. We will soon enjoy good cheer and a blessed feast together. So let us first relieve you, our very family, of all worry. Tell your king, your father, what sorrows have burdened your heart, so that he may relieve your want and woe." While the commoners rushed to be the first to be recognized by the king, Belshazzar moved from his place to the right of the throne. Belshazzar wore a horned skull taken from an unknown beast with tusks and sharp fangs. The leather straps that crossed his chest were augmented with a harness to support a pair of skeletal wings that spread from his back like butchered angel wings. In a voice filled with mock reverence to conceal his disdain, the high priest of Bel spoke, "My lord, king of kings, Cyrus the Great, victor of Persia, ruler of the world, hear my supplication as your most base and unworthy servant." Hab saw the game was to be joined swiftly. His eyes darted from the foul, deathly Belshazzar to the glimmering king. "Speak, faithful Belshazzar, honored high priest of Bel, the great devourer. Tell your king what trouble rests in your heart." Belshazzar tore at his garment in a bit of cheap theatrics and then wailed, "King of kings, the house of Bel, the owl-devouring maw, his sacred temple in this very city, august Babylon, has been desecrated, and his sacred rites defiled by the Israelite Daniel. This man, this obedient servant of the King of Kings," he charged, pointing accusatorily toward the white-haired Daniel, standing there calmly. "This man has many times assailed our faith in his intolerance, directly defying the law set by our gloried king. We seek to worship our God and receive his blessings for our families and our crops in the freedom promised us by the great king of Persia. We have suffered patiently while Daniel has committed outrage after outrage upon us. But this lawbreaker went too far in stealing our prized offering from Bel's very temple. To this man who violates the king's own laws, justice must come from the king. For Daniel's repeated, outrageous crimes against the gods, he must pay with his life." A great applause sounded from the crowd, sending chills down Hab's spine. He was surrounded by those cheering on the protests of this child murderer. The prophets of old had been right in decrying the wickedness of Babylon, he thought. Daniel protested, "I have pleased the one true God with my deeds." A stern flash of the hand from the royal governor silenced the Israelite. The King of Kings sat still, unmoved as a mountain blown by the wind. "Daniel, honored member of the nation of Israel, what say you to these charges? Are you innocent of this crime, brought to us by the most esteemed Belshazzar?" Daniel stepped forward, his eyes hard. "King of Kings and glory of the sun, I did these things as accused, and would do so again if it saved even one innocent life." Cyrus did not miss a moment, this playing out no doubt as Hab heard him and Daniel rehearse. "Then let it be proclaimed! Daniel of the nation of Israel has committed the crimes of religious intolerance and injury to the faithful of Bel and his temple. Daniel is sentenced to 3 years in exile and to pay a fine of 100 pounds of silver to Belshazzar, the blessed plaintiff. Let the people of Babylon know their father is just!" A smattering of applause greeted the pronouncement, but the high priest was not impressed. Belshazzar objected. "Great lord, I beseech you. In other judgments within your expansive kingdom, the King of Kings has sentenced to death those guilty of these crimes. Is Bel a less worthy god? Does the King of Kings not honor the law he himself made?" This challenge to the king shocked Hab. Not only was the king's decision to be final once pronounced, but the boldness of Belshazzar's challenge was breathtaking. Surrounded by Bel's faithful, Hab felt the air grow tense, and he worried that the high priest had prepared his followers for an uprising if their demands were not met. In a whisper that only Cyrus could hear, Belshazzar spoke.
If the King of Kings does not take Daniel's life for the blood stolen from Bel, his faithful will create such a feast of carnage that Bel will become engorged enough to block out the very sun."
Incensed by this challenge, Cyrus curtly declared, "If it be that Bel is so worthy of this man's blood, then Bel may have it. Let Bel take it himself." Behind the fangs and tusks, Belshazzar's face twisted from righteous indignation to a satisfied leer.
"As you command, my king of kings! This day I beseech you to personally escort the guilty man to meet my God. Bel will be most glad to collect his due with Cyrus the Great as witness from the justice given by his blessed son, the King of Kings."
Hab was confused by all this. While things were not going at all according to plan, Daniel had managed to embarrass the high priest by proving the stone idols in Bel's temples did not actually eat the food offerings left of them, but these tributes were eaten by the priests instead. Surely Belshazzar did not intend to be exposed as a charlatan again, this time with the king there to witness. Hab could see the same thoughts crossing the king's mind, and given the king's hesitation, Belshazzar must see it too. The high priest rushed to fill the silence left by Cyrus's hesitation.
"Yes, great Cyrus, our God has chosen to destroy Daniel the defiler himself. Bel invites you to bear witness to his greatness in the flesh," he triumphantly exclaimed. "When the King of Kings pleases, his humble servant and leader of Bel's faithful will take him, by paths unknown to all but those favored by our God, to witness the glory of Bel and the fulfillment of the king's judgment."
Cyrus sat still no longer. Turning his head to face Daniel, he saw a contented man. Hab saw the same thing. No doubt, he thought, Daniel had already known this would come to pass. The king rose. "Let us proceed at once, for justice must be swift for it to be justice and truth." Nodding to the royal governor to take his place, Cyrus walked down the ziggurat as his elite bodyguard assembled around him. Belshazzar smiled, his satisfaction clear even while masked by the skull of an unnameable beast. That sick leer inspired Hab to wonder if there was substance to the high priest's claim. If true, Hab worried, what good was Daniel's faith against the wrath of an all-devouring God? Cyrus rode with a dozen of the immortals, his elite horsemen, escorting Belshazzar and his chief acolyte, and Daniel and his apprentice out of the city. The high priest told them that at the end of a day's ride out to the west from the walls of Babylon, and in the dying of the light, they would find the dwelling place of his God in the earth. That his voice was absolutely certain in its triumph unnerved the Persians and the young man, who suspected that these immortals were in no more of a hurry than he was to meet a god called the Devourer. Daniel was unshaken. They rode hard into the wild on the king's finest horses. That Cyrus, his men, and Daniel seemed tireless in the ride did not surprise Hab, but rather that one so soft, pampered, and fat as Belshazzar did not complain nor slow to a gallop behind the hardened warriors leading the way. Instead, the corpulent sadist seemed animated by a zealot spirit, by the absolute conviction that victory was his, and that the great enemy of his God would soon be destroyed. The wind grew quieter the further they traveled toward the place of punishment, and unease over and beyond any fear of the unknown suffused the air. The soil became barren, the sky cast a strange tint of red, and the sun became obscure, as if a thin veil had been placed over it. Then the mountain came into view, jutting up from the forsaken desert. It looked alien to this world, as if it should not exist. In his many travels with Daniel, Hab had never seen this strange sight, nor heard any whispered stories about this black mountain. As they approached the towering basalt rock, Hab's trained eyes could not shake the idea that he saw windows and portals carved into the rock, weathered by eons of sand and wind. He wondered if this mountain was really a mountain at all, if perhaps it might instead be the burned ruins of the Tower of Babel, destroyed by God for the unspeakable blasphemies wrought by men there long ago. Hab noticed the wind no longer blew at all. The air was still. The only noise came from the travelers' breathing and the horses stamping and snorting, their reluctance to be here evident. Belshazzar chuckled. The king looked resolutely ahead. Daniel seemed at peace. One day, perhaps, mused Hab, it would gain his master's sense of invincibility. For now, he felt all too mortal. Something feels wrong here, Hab thought. With every breath he took, he felt sicker and sicker, as if the air was filled with poison. When the party neared the base of the darkened mountain, Belshazzar motioned for the king's men to halt their advance. As they objected, Belshazzar bowed in his saddle, noting aloud, "I have no weapons. Bel wishes King Cyrus no harm.
He is to bear witness that justice has been fulfilled, and then he will return to you."
The lead horseman was quick to take offense. "Watch your tone when speaking of the king." He went to draw his sword. The high priest's leering smile engulfed his face.
"Will violence ease your fear, soldier? There might be comfort in that familiar act to ease your nerves. Be careful, though, soldier. We are in Bel's kingdom now. We are all equal in his sight and to his hunger," he said, looking each immortal in the eye until they broke contact. "As I said, my god Bel wishes for his faithful servant, the king, to bring unto him the convicts for execution. Bel wishes to personally thank you for your offering," he finished, looking at Cyrus.
Cyrus nodded for the immortals to comply. Hab saw them pull their horses away from the mountain, no doubt slightly relieved to be even a few more paces distant from it.
"Come,"
muttered the high priest, as he, Cyrus, Daniel, and Hab rode alone to the base of the mountain. The horses whinnied and bucked to the point of open revolt. Their fear of what they sensed lay ahead overwhelmed their training. Hab held on for dear life while trying to keep from retching in his growing nausea when he heard Belshazzar mutter an unintelligible incantation from atop his perfectly calm horse. The animals grew docile enough to walk quietly to the end of the trackless path. When they stood a mere dozen paces from the Black Mountain, Belshazzar swung himself down from the saddle. Reaching down between his feet, he took a handful of parched soil from the earth, and Hab saw him mutter another incantation. When the high priest finished, a shadow cast on the rocks by the setting sun deepened until it became the yawning mouth of a cave. "In you go, my king. Lead the prisoners to the inner temple. The way will be clear. Watch the sacrifice and return," he said, approaching the mounted king. "And your law and empire will be upheld with the blessings of my God, who you will see is the greatest of them all." Cyrus bristled, but he was bound to his word. Dismounting, he walked toward the cave. Daniel dismounted, walking to join his monarch and friend.
"You too," grinned Belshazzar, looking at Hab. "You were his accomplice. You too must face judgment."
Hab dismounted, reluctantly. He knew his guilt was real and this act he had never wanted to happen. Before Cyrus's foot touched the edge of darkness leading downward, Belshazzar called out, "My king! Wait a moment before descending. Return to me so I may give you the marking of Bel's blessing. With this sign, my God will not devour you in his righteous fury. He will honor those faithful to him, and you may escape to bear witness to the completion of your justice." Daniel shouted in defiance, "Bel thrives on devouring his own!"
Belshazzar laughed fully and deeply. "So he does!"
Cyrus turned to do as he was told, but Daniel stopped him. "My king, you will not be spared if you go with us. You must stay here, so that some light will be left to guide this fallen world if we do not return." Cyrus understood and handed Daniel an unlit torch. "May the eternal flame of heaven protect you." Hab noted that the king's arm trembled. Hab realized he was not alone in his ill feeling. There was no more time for speeches or grandstanding, and he might be about to be eaten by this damned mountain. Hab's mind raced furiously, desperately grasping for any means of escape. He felt like he had a poisonous stone in his gut, and he wanted nothing more than to throw up and die here without further ado, and not by being torn apart and eaten by an angry god who he had wanted to leave alone in the first place. His face green with sickness. He took his last deep breath to brace himself for what he was about to do, but then he felt a hand on his back. He looked to see Daniel beside him, smiling, as hale and hearty as ever. "Come, boy. God is watching us, and we must not fail him. I need your help to carry our small light into the great darkness." His stomach calmed unexpectedly, and Hab knew there could be no more delay. His master decided his fate for him once again. The shadow had indeed become a gateway to beneath the mountain, and they walked down a dust-covered, smooth floor into the cavern. Hab judged this cave to be no natural formation. The opening was regularly spaced in both width and height, leading steadily downward with what looked to be rib-like sections of stone carved at even intervals as far as he could see in the faint light. Just as the light from the sun began to fade, Hab began scouring about the passage, trying to find a way to light his torch. Daniel reached out to stop him, saying, "Habakkuk, fret not with such things. God will light our way." Praying quietly, Daniel reached his right hand toward the last of the dying light outside the cave, and to Hab's amazement, pulled into his hand the last bit of sunlight. It floated there, weak, but still the light of the sun and of the world God created, not of this abyss.
We'll use this to guide our way. The fire of the torch will betray us too quickly to whatever foul beast is in here. This light is of the Creator, and it can only be seen by those with the light within them to see it.
Hab had never witnessed this miracle before, even though he had seen Daniel work a number of deeds that defied explanation in his battles with the minions of hell. He was entranced by the thin, warm ball of light, not noticing the fall of night outside, nor the strength that returned to his body. He was ready to go, to follow his master wherever this light may guide them. The path continued down into the depths, and it increasingly seemed as though the stale air itself pressed in around them, trying to snuff out the light guiding their way. Moments of quiet walking turned into tens of minutes, and then into hours. Yet no assassins leapt from the shadows, nor did any fire-breathing, roaring dragon accost them with its horns and claws. The sights Hab thought he saw carved into the mountain above were mirrored by the specters of the same below, broken archways, cracked columns, and windows filled with ruin. Sometimes Hab thought he beheld doors which never had light spilled across their thresholds, but which nevertheless beckoned him to enter into their mysteries. He ignored such temptation, but he had to wonder, why had he seen no trace of the men who wrought this? Not one bone, not one skull, not even one spider web presented itself. At long last, when the strength of any soldier would have already been exhausted by the day's ride and ensuing trek, the tireless master and student saw an unexpected sight. Before them, at the end of their journey, so very deep beneath the earth, a temple came into view. It was built in the fashion of the forgotten stargazers Daniel had taught Hab about. There was a series of cyclopean pillars placed in a circle, and a stone ring connected the smooth, perfectly angled square pillars together. Hab had seen no seams in the rock, as if this entire structure had been built from one perfect stone. As they looked upon the temple, Hab quietly asked, "Master, you have described such a thing as this to me before, a temple of the stargazers. Why did they build one underground?" Daniel, not taking his eyes off the pillars, answered, "I beheld some such circles in the Northlands, before one reaches Mount Ararat, and some to the west and south. There's powerful sorcery here, and devilry, of which we must beware." As they tarried, a shrill whisper of such intensity it nearly deafened them both sounded from within the circle of the pillars. The light of the Creator wavered, but remained while Hab doubled over in agony, his entire body overwhelmed with pain. Something in the whisper sent Hab's mind through the trapdoor of barely contained memory, and there he was again, 8 summers old, screaming and struggling to grab Daniel's outstretched hand, desperate to be free of the grasping, cold, dead hands clutching after his kicking legs. As he screamed for help, he felt his master's hand grab his once again, pulling him free of the clawing corpses of the darkness. The memory faded, but Daniel's strong grip, like a lion's paw, remained. Hab's mouth was dry, and his body was drenched in sweat, but he felt his breath returning. The light hovered above Daniel's shoulder, and his master kneeled before him, holding Hab in a sitting position. "Master," he croaked, "you saved me." Daniel smiled comfortingly, and Hab wondered at his master being completely unshaken. "God has a purpose for you yet. I, his servant, will save you until his purpose is fulfilled. We have been summoned." That sound was but an invitation. Walking toward the pillars, Hab noticed strange runes carved, almost freshly so, into their exteriors. As they entered the circle, a sickly scent, composed in equal measures of honey and burning tar, grew in intensity. The ceiling of the temple disappeared into the darkness beyond the weak light taken from the sun so far away, and the smooth stone floor was completely bare. Having expected a tomb filled with the horrors of human and animal sacrifice, this sterile emptiness was unsettling. A heavy silence filled the chamber. The light flickered. A rending sound erupted from the darkness in the form of jagged bass, shaking both Hab and Daniel inside out, filling them with revulsion and causing Hab to retch uncontrollably. He was the first to fall, his eyes starting to bleed and his ears filling with an unbearable ringing noise. Blindly, he reached out to Daniel for succor. Daniel was not even looking at his student. Instead, he faced resolutely out into the darkness, beyond the light, fighting the sickness he felt in the core of his being. He ignored Hab's weak croaks for relief. Daniel placed the dying sunlight behind him, just over Hab's convulsing body, and walked to the edge of the light.
Hab saw a flurry of images as he rolled in agony, scenes from his worst memories and of things yet to come. Yet he knew part of what he saw was right in front of him. Bel, the god. A shimmering, multi-mouthed thing of scintillating, hungry darkness that snapped at his master, a dragon from hell incarnate, built from mind-bending shapes and lines, warping reality as it moved. It was neither animal nor insect, nor crawling thing nor creature from the sea. Calling this thing a creature would be a fundamental error, as creatures have a creator, and this thing surely had none. The sight of this thing from before the light became too much for Hab's mind to bear, and his eyes rolled back, leaving him to see only the darkness inside his own mind. He rolled and convulsed, screaming as hard as he could, even though his lungs felt filled with a heavy, suffocating air. Whether merely a few moments or an eternity later, everything grew quiet. Everything, once again, grew still. Hab's eyes rolled back to their proper place, and he saw the light. He focused on the tiny mote of sunlight floating above him, all that was left of what Daniel plucked from the sky, barely more than a strand of golden straw at this point. He lay on his back on the temple floor, barely able to see more than a few inches beyond that golden thread. He was bloody all over, but alive. There was no sign of Daniel or the thing from the darkness. Hab shuddered merely to remember. Crawling around the temple, feeling his fate was decided, and perhaps this devouring hell was where his soul would be trapped forever, he looked for his master. Finding Daniel lying on the ground, Hab reached out to comfort his master. "Master," he whispered, "is it gone?" Nearly catatonic, Daniel gasped out a few words, none of which Hab could understand. "Master, come back to me. I have you. You're with me, Hab." Daniel started crying uncontrollably, and Hab doubted his master even knew why. Daniel struggled to hand something to Hab, his hand barely holding the object, so large it was. Hab took it while continuing to whisper reassuringly to his troubled master. He had no idea what it could be. A deep blue crystal the size of a man's skull, the likes of which he had never seen. It weighed nothing, and but for fear of its origin, Hab would have found it entrancingly beautiful. I took it," spat Daniel. "Took it from where, master?" From Bel. It is the eye of the dragon." Daniel's chest heaved, his lips quivered, and his tears poured forth. Hab knew the agony his master felt, for his young mind had felt it before. It was a drowning feeling of which only the maddest are capable of knowing, their entire existence overwhelmed with futile agony of being in a world that will one day swallow them whole. Yet here he was, the student, tortured by feelings of doubt and fear, completely rendered helpless by the mere sight of the demon god Bel. And now he cradled the gibbering, sobbing wreck of a man he'd thought invincible through the grace of God. Hab held him, smoothing his hair, whispering comforting words to his master, even as the last light of the sun vanished, leaving them in silent darkness. Eventually, Daniel grew quiet and shivered no more. Hab still felt life within his master, and he offered a silent prayer to God for seeing his old servant through this. Hab felt relieved in a way he had never known possible. Of all the horrors and depravity he had faced with Daniel, this had been the worst by far. Bel had been the apotheosis of all the dreams held by the devil worshippers and wicked cultists he and Daniel had defeated. But here they were, still drawing breath. He knew that if he, an experienced foe of the infernal, had collapsed so quickly in this place, no mere mortal could possibly have fared better. But Daniel had. He had faced the demon and somehow, some way triumphed. It had to be a miracle. There could be no other explanation. God had willed it. Despite all the hours of hard riding, of fearful trekking, and torture he had endured, Hab was not tired, and so he stayed there on the floor, holding his master until he would awaken. When Daniel came to, he did not speak. He had no need for words. Hab helped him up and slowly, carefully, walked his trembling master out of the pit into the first rays of the dawning light.
Hab's eyes hurt, and even this weak light after such all-consuming darkness. But he beheld the clear astonishment of those men they had left above ground. He first saw the once smug Belshazzar, rendered slack-jawed by the meaning inherent in his victim's emergence from Bel's lair. The grim Cyrus, still standing as close to the mouth of the cave as he dared, dearly wanted to believe his eyes at their re-emergence. Cyrus spoke first, his voice hopeful but skeptical. "Daniel? Habakkuk, is it you? Do my eyes see true as the eagle's, or does the rising sun cast shadows that will fill my heart with despair?" Daniel could not speak, and his eyes stared far off. His triumph had exacted a terrible cost. Hab spoke for him. With his master leaning against his right side, Hab raised his clenched fist triumphantly into the air. The light of dawn gleamed off the deep blue facets of the eye of the dragon. The sight confirmed Belshazzar's newfound fear. Visibly crushed, the fat man fell to his knees and began to wail. Hab sneered at the priest in satisfaction. Hab had no doubt that Belshazzar's rise to power had been aided by a demonic pact with Bel, and now all of the horrific things he had done to please his infernal master was for naught. There would be no more false miracles to deceive the people of Babylon. A worse fate awaited Belshazzar with his murderous followers when word of the death of his god made it back to them. Hab had barely finished that thought when he heard the dagger of Belshazzar's lieutenant come unsheathed behind the wailing priest. Belshazzar had failed his god, a god who devoured the weak. Justice would be served this day. Cyrus moved to take Daniel from the young man, but Hab stopped the king, saying gently, "King Cyrus, he is my master and my friend. He is my burden to bear." Cyrus, towering above the two Israelites, nodded in respect. Hab demonstrated a true soldier's care for a wounded comrade. "Immortals, mount up! The king's judgment has been fulfilled. Daniel the Israelite has been absolved of his crimes against Bel, the all-devourer, through trial by combat. We return to Babylon in triumph," he roared with pride. And that, my dear friends, is the end of Daniel and the Dragon. I had a lot of fun writing that. But there were parts that got left out of it due to space constraints, because it is a short story collection and there are page numbers and word count targets that the publisher had. So some of the more descriptive elements I had to add in to make it even weirder of a story did get cut out. But not a whole lot, because Laureen Cantwell got to those fairly early on and gave me the directions of, okay, this is what we're really looking for here. This other stuff's neat, don't throw it away, but do you really need it to tell the story? And I agreed they were nice to haves, not need to haves. But if anybody's interested in an expansion on that, let me know in the comments below. I'd be happy to revisit this and expand on those elements. And as I thought then, I still think now, this could be a good series of adventures for dark young adult stories, because the Bible's full of them. If anybody thinks that the Bible is some boring read with a bunch of safe or PC namby-pamby stuff in it, you really haven't read the Bible, except for Numbers and Deuteronomy. Those are pretty boring. But the rest of it, like the book of Amos, my favorite prophet, I mean, Daniel's cool, but Amos, his entire spiel was going and telling Israel, y'all done screwed up, and y'all better listen to me or God's going to smite you. And they didn't listen to him, so God smote them. There is all kinds of quality shade and horrifying events that happen in the Bible, because the history of humanity is filled with horror and fear. And so that's why I take comfort in the fact that when God sends one of his messengers to mankind, one of the first things he says is, be not afraid. So, dear friends, let us not be afraid. Let us carry our light into the world. Let us follow in the footsteps of the prophet Daniel, fight against the wicked, and embrace the light of the Lord. If you enjoyed this, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it around. If you have younger relatives that are into literature and could use some more exposure to the Bible, send them this. And again, thank you to Laureen Cantwell, my dear friend, for the opportunity to tell this story, and hopefully make at least one other person aware of how amazing the prophet Daniel and Habakkuk were. May we see them in heaven. My dear friends, that's what I got for now. And until next time, I wish you nothing but the best.